Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Tirri, and welcome to my video overview of my Change Agent project for the Inclusive Education Seminar here at Stockton University. I appreciate your time, and I apologize in advance for my voice. Of course, I get a little bit sick just as I have to do this presentation for all of you. But to dive right in, my focus question for this project was really thinking about how could I enable my students to do tasks, in my 12th grade English class that weren't just writing. So my question here is, how can I universally design learning experiences that heighten student engagement, first and foremost, and incorporate greater choice so I can then encourage more diverse means of action and expression? So right here in this question, you're seeing that all of the avenues for universal design for learning are going to be incorporated at some point throughout this project. So stay tuned for those a little bit later. My rationale for this project had multiple perspectives kind of tied into it. So the first is I kind of had to check myself as an English teacher who genuinely loves to write. So I understand that it's easy for me to incorrectly assume that my students are going to be super excited to write another essay at the end of each unit, just as I would be if I were a student. It's also deceptively easy for me to not account for how an unfamiliar or difficult text, like Macbeth by Shakespeare, makes the writing task sort of like it doubles the difficulty for these students, because on the one hand you have a text that has unfamiliar language, but then you're asking students to do a task that they're not necessarily comfortable with, so put them together, not a great match. My second rationale is that this project really nicely aligned with my professional learning team and I starting to plan our Macbeth unit for this year. And my experience with this unit from my first year of teaching last year was that it did not go well, especially when it came time for the final project. So I kind of tried to look a little bit deeper at, okay, I have students who are already not engaged because the language is difficult and unfamiliar to them, but I also remember how convoluted the final project was. And being a new teacher, I wasn't necessarily authorized or even experienced enough to recreate an entire project. So I kind of just had to go with it. So I figured, why not use this UDL-based project to make the best of this unit? And then finally, I wanted to make a project that somehow incorporated all three pillars of universal design for learning. So the engagement, the representation, and the action and expression portions. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So here's just some bits and pieces of research that I conducted as I was starting to conceptualize this project. The first is all about how do you properly adapt challenging text for students with disabilities. Then we have the importance of multimodal literacy, so that students are learning how to compose not just with a pen and paper or a keyboard and a screen, especially because they're going to need multimedia skills in whatever fields they choose after high school. A bit of research on just general inclusive education practices and why those are really what we should be focusing on. This idea that inclusive education helps us respond to and respect human differences in ways that include everyone, a way to extend what is ordinary to everyone instead of doing things differently for just some. And thirdly, creating lessons and learning opportunities for everyone. That way everyone has equal and equitable access to the curriculum. Another bit of research just here on UDL and planning, just to emphasize that UDL should come at the beginning of the planning process as opposed to at the end of the implementation process. That way UDL feels a lot more proactive rather than reactive. And since my project for this class is based on choice, I have a tidbit here about choice, which is that it increases motivation, effort, and learning, and encourages students to learn more or perform more efficiently when done properly and consistently within the classroom. And finally, I'm also going to be incorporating multiple intelligences into this project. So I have two quotes here that focus on what is the benefit of Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. So the first, that it helps us as teachers expand our repertoire to make sure that every type of student has an opportunity to show their understanding to the best of their abilities. And that it also it expands the curriculum, it creates an inclusive education environment, and hopefully has all of those benefits when done appropriately. All right, so let's look at the action steps that I took in the creation of this project. So just a disclaimer before I get into these, unfortunately, the project has not yet been completed. On the way that Stockton's semester aligns with the unit is that it was good up until this point, but unfortunately my students won't really start the project for a week or so after the semester ends. So I'm just going to give you all sort of the breadcrumbs leading up to what I'm hoping the students will do, and I'm very willing to follow up with it after the students complete their projects. So my first action step was sitting down with my professional learning team full of my 12th grade English teachers and starting to brainstorm ideas. So to propose to them my focus question about engagement and choice, and thinking, okay, well, Macbeth is coming up, so why not use it? And thankfully, I work with a bunch of colleagues who are always interested in figuring out what can we do differently, what can we do that's new and exciting, and at the end of the day, what can we do that really helps our students in the best way possible? My next action step was actually thinking about engagement. So how could I get students excited, or as excited as possible, about Shakespeare, and what types of questions would I want them to start thinking about before we even read the text? So I created this anticipation guide where it asks students to respond to a series of prompts, whether they be statements or questions, all about deeper psychological and philosophical concepts. So for instance, violence leads to more violence, we cannot control our fate, thinking about evil and what causes people to do certain things. And this anticipation guide, as you see on the screen, just asks them to agree or disagree and then write their justification. So originally when I created this anticipation guide, I was just expecting, your average type of class discussion, but thankfully, I actually have a handful of students in each of my classes who are very passionate about debating, and their passion for it ended up sparking me to be able to do this. So I directed a Socratic seminar with each of my classes where one student in each class thankfully offered to moderate it for all of us. And I just sort of sat back and listened to all of them politely and respectfully debate each other. And it was really kind of one of those magical teaching moments, as awful as that sounds, because I really just got to sit back and watch them do all the work for us. So my next action step was also part of engagement, was thinking about what are the important literary devices throughout the play that we want to highlight that align with the standards and the curricular documents. And I figured, okay, one of my co-teachers had already thought about using song journals to help show these literary devices. So I helped her design this worksheet we have here on the right side. And we just tried to pick songs that were a range of genres that stem from the 90s up until today, and making sure they're school appropriate, and choosing songs that really do embody those literary terms. That way students can see them in a different context rather than just being quizzed on them over and over and over again, or asking them what's a metaphor, what's characterization, and things like that. So rather than asking them to do it, why not have them listen to a song that embodies characterization, or something like tragedy or tragic hero. And then that worksheet helps guide our conversation, and it gives them a helpful guide to learning how to break down a text and being able to pick out evidence and placing it into like a claim and a rationale kind of thing. So early steps for argumentation, preparing them for the project. My next action step was for representation purposes. So thinking about, okay, rather than just telling them to use No Fear Shakespeare, obviously I make that available to them, but thinking about how can I create an interactive graphic organizer and reading guide at the same time. That way they have all their notes in one place. So what I did was I had the original text on the left-hand column, and then I have a whole blank column on the right where they can write their annotations while they read independently or with a partner, or as we discuss as a class. And that way they have their notes right next to the original language, which hopefully should help them be able to answer questions afterward. Next step was thinking about, okay, not all these multiple intelligences are necessarily quote-unquote natural to English teachers, so I reached out to colleagues in the history and psychology departments to figure out, okay, if I want to have a student do a project that's based on existential intelligence, what would a product even look like? Or thinking about, visual spatial, what would that look like? So thankfully I had those colleagues be able to come through for me, and I was able to bring that information back to my PLT. Next action step was Now we're taking psychological concepts that are going to be important for the final project and for understanding Macbeth and his wife. How can we identify those same concepts in other forms of popular culture that they might be a little bit more familiar with? So this was sort of a gallery tour kind of activity where they just had to identify what concept was represented by each character, and then we just talked about it in class. So again, another example of engagement. Next step, this is where we started thinking about actually planning the project. So I had to draft an overview of what the multiple intelligence based final project would look like. So they have to choose a psychological concept and kind of pair that to a specific character, either Macbeth or Lady Macbeth, and then figure out from there what intelligence best fits them, and then choosing a product that relates to that intelligence, keeping in mind that character, how they change, why they change, and what psychological phenomenon are going on at the same time. And thankfully, at this point, our special ed co-teachers were deeply involved in the process with us. So after the overview, my next step was to think about a proposal to get students thinking about, okay, what's the evidence from the play that I'm going to use to help prove my point? Start thinking about what products they want to include or products they want to explore, what next steps do they need, what kind of supports they need from me, and that way I can intervene early if I think that a student is going to struggle and might need a little bit more guidance or redirection. My final step was sitting down with one of my special ed co-teachers and designing what I said was an intuitive, inclusive, and measurable rubric that helps accommodate for all the range of learners and products that we would be getting for this assignment. So obviously, there are at least 2 or 3 dozen product choices that they have. So we had to think about, okay, just focusing on that standard, how can we make this rubric general enough that it incorporates or encompasses all of those products? And hopefully this works out for us. We have things like presence of evidence, their analysis of their concept and their character, their level of professionalism and effort in their product, and then their ability to do proper citation. So those are kind of the major things that we want them to hit in this project, regardless of the product that they choose. Okay. So then looking at some data to support effectiveness, I kind of charted all of my classes in their formative assessments just for some numerical data, because at this point I just have a lot of anecdotal data, so I wanted to try to give best of both worlds. So only my period 3 honors class and my period 4 academic classes really experience gradual increases over each assessment. So I think although the data doesn't look like it's working, it actually does support my decision to do a project that's not based solely on testing students in their ability to answer reading comprehension questions. So I was a little disheartened at first, but I think that it actually does fit in the long term, especially when I look at my anecdotal data. So my participation has been so much better compared to what was happening last year. We have debates, we have great discussions, and I'm actually really pleased with how my students are able to offer me unique insights I hadn't even thought about. And thankfully, on a given day, at least 80% of students are willing to share their opinions, defend them, revise them based on everyone else's feedback, and then respecting each other's opinions, which I think is really great. So at least I'm seeing engagement. And then, of course, my students are really curious as to how this project is all going to shake out. And every time they ask, and I give them bits and pieces about how it's going to be non-essay based, and they're going to have all these choices, their eyes kind of light up, which I think is really crucial when you're dealing with seniors who are just ready to graduate. So to wrap it all up, what changes in myself have I really seen? So I think first and foremost, it's that planning really is involved, and it really is a step-by-step process where if you're planning on incorporating some elements of universal design for learning, you can't just do it in one session with your professional learning team. It has to be something that takes time and effort, especially if you want it to work well. I also started thinking that even the smallest classroom activities really should have that inclusive element built into them, because the smaller activities are really what are the building blocks for those larger assignments. I also learned about myself that I'm really good at designing curriculum, and that I think now that I'm a little bit better at this, that hopefully in the coming months I can accommodate and value all learners in our coming units that are not just Macbeth. And that's basically everything. So if you need any materials, let me know. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and Have a good afternoon. See you later.